What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And as always, if you would rather listen to this content in podcast form, go and check out Crime Bit with Danelle Hallan anywhere that you like to consume your podcast, and I'll be there waiting for you. Today, we are going to be talking about an incredibly challenging case, but I feel like I've discussed a lot of sensitive things over the past couple of videos when it comes to child welfare and why there's a lot of push to change legislation when you have a new case that comes up. For example, the one of Emily Pike that I covered last week. And so after Emily's case, I really wanted to show you guys what can happen when you successfully push for changes in legislation, how many lives can be saved, the good that can be done. And I felt like there was really no other way to accurately show that to you guys without talking about the case of Elisa Izquierdo. Elisa Izquierdo was a 6-year-old child whose life was tragically and horrifically cut short by prolonged abuse and neglect, a clear failure of the system that was designed to protect her, the most vulnerable. Her death went on to expose deep flaws in the welfare practices, but in the same breath, people used that to spur significant legislative reforms. And so her death ended up leaving a legacy known as Elisa's Law, which basically mandates greater transparency and accountability in handling child abuse cases, which I will obviously get way more in depth on later on in the video. But I do want to say viewer discretion is absolutely advised on this video. There is horrific abuse involved in this case in all forms. I have done my absolute best to not go into significant detail. I really don't think it's necessary, but even at its barest form, it is absolutely awful to hear. It's probably one of the worst things I've ever heard of happening to a child. And I know a lot of you guys are very, very sensitive to true crime cases revolving around children. So I completely understand if this is not one that you can sit through. But for those of you that want to understand how this case so drastically impacted our children from that point on and will for the future, and why it's so important to push for these changes, then this is definitely a case that you're going to want to hear about. So without further ado, this is the heartbreaking story of Elisa Izquierdo and the lasting impact that her case has had on protecting children. Thanksgiving morning in November of 1995 ended up becoming one of New York City's most painful chapters. A call came into 911 from an apartment in the Lower East Side. That morning, 6-year-old Elisa Izquierdo had been found unresponsive in her small bedroom. When emergency responders arrived on the scene, they discovered Elisa lying in her bed, showing signs of severe neglect and physical trauma. As police and paramedics documented the scene, they struggled to understand how something that horrific could have happened to a little girl. And in the hours that followed, investigators started to piece together the unimaginable, a pattern of abuse that had persisted for not just months, but for years. And time again, so many people had the chance to stop it, but every single time they fell short. This was an entirely preventable death. Elisa should be alive and well today and thriving. Shortly after authorities had arrived at the apartment, they arrested Elisa's mother, Awilda Lopez. And while most mothers at this point would be inconsolable, grieving, hysterical, all the things, Awilda instead made a shocking confession. Her disturbing admission revealed the tragic reality of Elisa's life and also her death. Elisa had died at the hands of her own mother. So to understand how something like this could possibly occur, we have to go all the way back in time. Now, Awilda Lopez, Elisa's mother, was, I believe, born in Puerto Rico. She was at least from Puerto Rican descent, and she was raised in Brooklyn, or at least somewhere in like the Manhattan, Bronx, Brooklyn area. And in her youth, Awilda excelled in school. She earned trophies, attendance awards, and her early promise really kind of sparked hope for her mother that she would lead a better life than many in her community had. There was a lot of generational trauma involved, drug abuse, physical abuse, and obviously no parent wants that for their child. And with Awilda, she seemed to have such a drive to do better that her mother really clung to that hope. It was like her biggest wish that Awilda would escape it all. However, as she grew, the allure of the streets and even more particularly young men seemed to take over. By the mid-1980s, Awilda's focus shifted from her academics to young men. And she was still in school at the time, I believe junior high going into actual high school, when she ended up setting her eyes on a man named Ruben Rivera. And it wasn't long at all before Awilda fell pregnant with the first child that they would have together. So by 1986, she was going through her first pregnancy, and because of all these changes, she ended up dropping out of school and moved into Ruben's apartment with him on Knickerbocker Avenue, which, according to sources, was a neighborhood just notorious for its drug trade and poverty. Shortly after having her first child, she went on to have a second. And with the pressure of raising two kids very young and trying to keep together a family, it wasn't long until she fell prey to the drugs like so many others. When you have neighborhoods like this, where there's obviously people struggling mentally, financially, like in every possible aspect of life, there's a reason why drug dealers love those areas, because you have desperate people looking for an escape, and they're easy prey. They're a good way to make money, and Awilda ended up being one of those people. By 1988, addiction to cocaine had a very strong grip on Awilda. She began using her welfare checks that were supposed to go to funding her children to instead funding her habit, and she started to essentially abandon her kids. I mean, she would leave them for weeks at a time, days at a time, sometimes with family, sometimes with friends, and sometimes when she was very desperate, she would just leave them on her own because drugs were her top priority. It was the only thing she was thinking about. It was the only thing she cared about, and her children always came second. And honestly, second's probably still placing them way too high for Awilda. The destructive pattern just continued to escalate, and within a short time, things started to just snowball downhill. Ruben, from my understanding, also was heavily using drugs, so most of their funds were just funneling straight towards maintaining their drug use, and so obviously this led to them being evicted from their apartment. And once they were evicted from their apartment, it seems that started to create an even bigger wedge in their relationship. So not only did they lose their home, but Ruben and Awilda split ways, and so at that point, Awilda went with her two children to live at a local homeless shelter. And even while at this homeless shelter, her patterns were still continuing. And after a while, concerned friends and family finally called welfare after yet another stint of abandoning her kids. It seems at this point, they're like, if we don't do something, she's not going to stop. We can't keep, enabling this behavior. And so she ended up losing custody of both of her children. But amid all of this chaos, legitimately, at the time her children were taken away, she was 8 months pregnant. Another child was about to be born. So apparently, while Awilda was staying at the local homeless shelter, she met an incredible man named Gustavo Izquierdo. He was a Cuban immigrant. He was working as a cook at the shelter, and I think he was also a caretaker for someone. And he had come to America with dreams of becoming a dance teacher, but obviously he had to make money in the meantime, so that's what he was doing. And he was a really incredible guy. He had great work ethic. He was really kind, a great heart. And I genuinely believe that she saw this and was like, oh, this would be a great person to pretty much take care of me forever so I can do whatever I want. And they started a relationship. Now, apparently, that entire time, she was still heavily using cocaine, and Gustavo had no idea. So he's over here thinking, okay, we're about to bring a baby into the world. This woman is just trying to turn her life around. We can do this together. But that's not at all what happened, because when her children got taken away, a month before their baby was born, is when he realized, I am literally having a baby with a woman who is prioritizing drugs over her kids. This is terrifying. And on February 11th, 1989, Elisa Izquierdo was born addicted to cocaine and struggling with the effects of exposure. And so that's obviously not going to work. So child welfare immediately took Elisa out of Awilda's custody, and Gustavo ended up being awarded full custody of the baby girl. And he was far from prepared to be a father, but Gustavo was determined to give Elisa the best chance at life. And he ended up being everything that Elisa needed. In those early days when Elisa was a newborn, he made many frantic phone calls to women that he knew asking for help, like, what diaper brand do I buy? How do I properly put on a diaper? What formula do I need to get? When there was the slightest sign of discomfort, Gustavo was on the phone with doctors, like, please, how do I make sure my girl's comfortable? He started taking parenting classes at the YWCA. He was trying the absolute most to be the best father possible. Neighbors recalled how proudly he would walk around town with Elisa in his arms. He had his wallet stuffed to the brim with dozens of pictures of her. They were living a beautiful life. She literally became the very center of his world, something that never would have happened had she remained in the custody of her mother. By the early 1990s, he decided to enroll Elisa, who was almost 2 years old at this point, into a Montessori preschool, and she thrived there. She had every teacher in love with her from like the first moments. She was always smiling and laughing. She didn't know a stranger. She just seeped love and acceptance and happiness from her pores. And she was also so eager to learn. She was so smart. And it was just incredible to a lot of people to see this little girl that came from such a difficult situation grow into what Elisa had. Gustavo was having troubles of his own because he was a single father. He was working his hardest, tuition was high, and so he was late a few of the payments. But the school had an idea because they knew how much promise Elisa had, and they knew of a way to help her. And so during a visit to her preschool, Prince Michael of Greece, yes, an actual prince, was on a goodwill tour. He would never become king because they just didn't have that same system anymore, but he was still in charge of like redistributing wealth and things like that. So he went to this preschool and he had been so impressed by Elisa's kind heart and her demeanor. Like the moment he walked out, she ran up to him and gave him a hug. And so he made several trips to spend time with these children with the hope of sponsoring some of their educations. And so he'd bring them gifts and encourage them to continue their education. And Elisa was always there waiting with a thank you note or a gift in return. And it just really seemed to hit Prince Michael's heart. And so after hearing her story, he actually offered to fund her entire education. And I'm not just talking about her few years in preschool, but preschool all the way through high school. And that is absolutely wild. So for a brief moment, it seemed that fate might be rewriting Elisa's story, that she had all the ingredients for an incredible future. Meanwhile, however, Awilda began to rebuild. And I wish this was a beautiful story about recovery and reunification and all the things that you hope happen for people. But unfortunately, this is just not that story. Awilda was determined to reclaim her children. And when she had to hand Elisa over to child welfare, they specifically told her she would not be getting any of her kids back unless she did a total 180 of her life. By December of 1990, Awilda ended up giving birth to her fourth child. So her first child that she would have with Carlos. And social workers at this point were so impressed with her turnaround because she and Carlos were attending parenting classes. They never missed or were late to a single meeting with the social workers. By all accounts, it appeared that Awilda was on the right path. An affidavit even noted her improved behavior, stating that she and Carlos were, quote, willing to go for random drug tests, and that Carlos specifically, quote, appeared to be gentle and understanding. And so I don't believe this fourth child was ever taken away from Awilda's custody. And not just that, after she gave birth to this fourth child, Awilda ended up regaining custody of her two oldest children, because the entire point of social services, their whole goal when it comes to child welfare is to promote reunification. And so that's always the end goal. And if they can get there, they're going to do it. And at this point, it seemed like Awilda could manage having her children back. She was still successfully in recovery, and they wanted to see her succeed as a parent. And so at this point, once she got her children back, she set her eyes on a way to get custody of Elisa as well. And so after a court hearing in November of 1991, that wish ended up coming true. Family court granted Awilda unsupervised visits with Elisa on alternating weekends. And so this was a start. Again, she'd been successfully raising her three other children so far. There hadn't been any hiccups. So why would this be any different? They expected the same positive results. But unfortunately, as it tends to happen, The Lopezes were really good at making sure social services, the courts, and the public only saw exactly what they wanted them to see. And behind closed doors, the inner workings of this family were pure evil. Neighbors and family members later reported that Awilda and Carlos's relationship was volatile. The moment darkness fell and they were in the privacy of their own home, neighbors said it would just erupt into chaos. They would hear pots and pans hitting the walls, dishes smashing, screaming, regular arguments, and this was a consistent everyday thing. But the moment that door opened back up and the family walked out of their home, it was all smiles, and you would never know the reality of what was going on behind the scenes. And that is exactly what Elisa walked into. And I just want to remind you that she was like 2, maybe about to be 3 years old at this point, and she had never spent time with her mother. Like, this was her biological mother, but her mother hadn't spent a single day raising her. Change is already so difficult for children. They're so used to routine. They thrive off of that. It's what brings them comfort. But when you also are giving that child to someone who's an absolute monster, it makes my stomach turn. I feel so devastated knowing all the information that I'm about to have to tell you. There was no beautiful period of time where they were trying to reconnect and establish a relationship and things were great. Pretty much immediately, it was a shit show. In particular, one of the very first weekends that Elisa spent with her mother, she witnessed horrific violence toward her mom at the hands of Carlos. I believe that Awilda had given birth to another child, and while she was feeding that baby, Carlos, for whatever reason, went berserk. I heard it had something to do with infidelity, but regardless, he ended up attacking Awilda with his pocket knife. He stabbed this woman 17 times in front of all these children. And so this horrifying act of violence not only left Awilda critically injured and the children traumatized, but it also led to the arrest of Carlos. And he was facing second-degree assault charges. And I kid you not, this man only spent 2 months incarcerated for stabbing someone 17 times. How that wasn't considered attempted murder is beyond me. But even worse, as if nothing had even happened, once he was released 2 months later, Carlos came right back home and they fell back into their routine. To absolutely no one's surprise, it didn't take long for Elisa to begin showing signs that something was terribly wrong. Elisa had started to come home from her weekends with her mom covered in bruises. And when her dad would ask her about the source of the bruises, Elisa would point to her mom and sometimes her stepfather, Carlos, saying that they would hurt her. Her teachers at the Montessori school also started to notice these bruises, and at one point, she either told her teacher or she might have told her dad. Reports on this case are very, very unclear. Regardless, Elisa told someone that Awilda had been locking her in a closet for hours, had hit her, and she specifically stated to an adult that she did not want to go back to Awilda. She said, "I don't want Awilda anymore." And as time passed, more signs of severe trauma and abuse continued. Elisa started to soil herself. She sometimes would vomit for no apparent reason. She started to struggle with night terrors, and she became withdrawn and quiet. And all of these behaviors peaked just before her trips to her mother's house and immediately after returning home. And I mean, her dad had spent so much time with her. She had spent so much time at this Montessori school, and everyone spoke about what an incredible, bubbly, happy child she was. And this was such a stark, drastic change in behavior. They felt like they could see just the life dimming out of Elisa's eyes by the day. And so with Elisa's deteriorating condition, Gustavo and several of those faculty members from the school decided to take every measure they could to alert Child Welfare Administration, or CWA. And their ultimate hope was that custody would be taken away from Awilda. They didn't want these weekend visits anymore. She didn't even know her mother to begin with. Her mom already had a history of having her children taken. Like, they felt like something would happen here. And child welfare did apparently look into it. They made visits to the family home because when she was given custody of Elisa, there was apparently some sort of stipulation in the court order that child welfare would have to be looking over Elisa for the first year and a half or something like that, or until at least they closed the case. So it was their responsibility to make sure they made the right decision, that they were supporting someone who actually did need to have her children back and not someone that was harming them. But despite all of these complaints and these changes that were noticed and these trips they took to the family home, nothing ever happened. Elisa was never taken away from her mother. And so she continued taking these weekend visits, and the abuse continued to be witnessed by everyone else in Elisa's life. And so in 1992, with growing frustration, Gustavo decided to take the custody case back to the courts. And so he brought forward all of this accumulated evidence, and he was begging them at this point to protect Elisa. But instead, the court ruled that they would allow Awilda to keep her partial custody of Elisa, but they were going to do one thing. They were going to add a stipulation that in order to continue seeing her daughter, she wasn't allowed to hurt her. I mean, something that you would think is so common knowledge, basic, expected behavior. They should have known having to put that as a stipulation in a court order probably meant that that person didn't need to have the child. So at this point, in an effort to hopefully eventually get authorities to listen and the courts to listen, Gustavo and Elisa's teachers began to document every single bruise, everything that Elisa would say about what happened at Awilda and Carlos's home. But the system that was supposed to protect her just remained deaf to her suffering. And they weren't the only ones turning a cheek to this horrific abuse. Awilda's siblings and mother had allegedly been told by Elisa's other siblings that there was abuse occurring within the home. These kids were even going and telling their neighbors about it, saying, yeah, when Elisa comes over, mommy and daddy beat her. Like horrible, horrible things. But Awilda's mom and her siblings that knew about it, in an effort to, quote, not get in the middle of it, kept quiet. And not just that, they even actually seemed to question if Elisa's siblings were even telling them the truth, because they claimed whenever they went over to the house, it was well managed, the kids were well behaved, everything was clean, and so they didn't see any signs of abuse. So I guess what these kids were saying must be a lie. And in 1993, when there was still little support from the courts and an obvious continuation and escalation of abuse, Gustavo felt like he had to make a decision. Like he could not sit back any longer and let the courts fail him and his daughter over and over again. He could not continue to allow Awilda to abuse this child. And so he decided to move himself and Elisa away. He was going to take her back to Cuba, where he believed she would finally be safe. Gustavo purchased plane tickets for both of them for May 26, 1994, determined to give Elisa the life that she deserved. This was like his last effort at doing the most he could to protect his daughter. But fate intervened cruelly. Just as they were preparing to leave, Gustavo ended up falling incredibly ill, and he ended up being hospitalized with severe respiratory problems. And those respiratory problems led to a diagnosis of terminal lung cancer. From what I have seen, the exact day their plane tickets were for, Gustavo passed away. 5-year-old Elisa, now orphaned in every possible sense of the word, was left in the care of a system that was already failing her. In the wake of Gustavo's death, the stakes for Elisa's safety became even higher because her father was her biggest advocate. Her father was her biggest protector. And now with him gone, Awilda filed for emergency custody. And so advocates jumped into action and started to plead relentlessly with child welfare and family courts to take action. Her teachers from the Montessori school, the director from the school, Prince Michael himself, Gustavo's family, all of them started to write letters to the judge about every sign of abuse that they had witnessed over the last 3 or so years. Elisa's bedwetting, her nightmares, her unexplained injuries that she had. And they repeatedly urged that Elisa not be placed in Awilda's custody. And Gustavo's cousin, Elsa, even stepped forward to fight for custody of Elisa herself. She knew that she would be able to give her a home. She had been helping Gustavo, taking care of Elisa, preparing to go to Cuba. And so she was more than willing to step in and be a parental figure for this little girl. Yet in a heartbreaking twist that I will never, ever be able to wrap my head around, in September of 1994, family court judge Phoebe Greenbaum awarded full custody to Awilda Lopez. But what I think is probably the most infuriating thing about this decision was how it came to be, and the people that supported Awilda so blindly in a way that made this judge feel like she was the best option for this little girl. Awilda showed up with the equivalent of a small army backing her. She appeared to be sober, completely back on her feet. She had the backing of a federally funded parenting program that was called Project Chance. She also had the legal aid representation as an attorney, and they portrayed her as reformed and fully capable. Even child welfare showed up backing her, saying that they had overseen Elisa's case since Awilda obtained partial custody, and they said things were going great. Despite all of these complaints from her father and family members and the school, he literally acted as if there hadn't been a single issue in the entire time she had been with Awilda. The fact that Carlos had gone on to stab Awilda in front of her. Documented information showing the home was not a good home to be in. They just skirted right around all of that. And even worse, I ended up finding in my research that when they looked into things after the fact, her caseworker was actually supposed to perform an investigation per court order for this hearing. He was supposed to have an entire document written up, was supposed to give a recommendation about what he felt was best for Elisa, but he didn't do it. And apparently, when child welfare was asked why he didn't do it, the only excuse they could come up with was that he forgot. And so the only reason they had any sort of statement from child welfare that day was actually because he just so happened to be in the court. And so they pulled him in from another court hearing, and he stood in front of the judge and was like, "Oh yeah, I visited the home. It was immaculate. She's a great mom." That's legitimately how this played out. That person is supposed to be the neutral party. They're supposed to be the ones that stand up for the child, that don't take sides, that look into everything as deeply as possible, because their say is weighed so heavily in the eyes of the court. Project Chance even described Awilda as, quote, lively and vibrant, and she loved her children beyond belief. And child welfare also went on to say that they had personally spoken to Elisa, and she adamantly stated she wanted to live with her mother, which I find very hard to believe given all of the other information we have so far, and her direct statement to someone outside of the home that Awilda put her in a closet and beat her, and she'd never wanted to see Awilda again. And so Awilda had all of these people from all these programs saying, "Yep, she's a great mom, go ahead." Meanwhile, Elisa's aunt Elsa had shown up without an attorney, but with the support of literally every person that had actually been an active part in Elisa's life, that witnessed all these signs of abuse. Dozens of people, but that wasn't enough. And this decision that this judge made would have irreversible consequences. After the custody ruling in September of 1994, Elisa was once again placed under the care of her mother. And immediately, Awilda made the decision to pull Elisa from that Montessori school that had nurtured her for most of her younger years and enrolled her in a public school in Manhattan. And based on her future behavior, I feel like I can confidently assume that she likely did this because those same teachers and that same director continued asking questions, continued pointing out the abuse. I doubt they made Awilda's life easy at all because they had witnessed the things that had happened the past few years. And so I'm sure she knew that they were watching closely and she would not be able to tolerate that. So I'm sure she thought, I'm going to move her to this public school. Public school in the middle of Manhattan. She's going to get lost in the sea of students. No one's going to be paying close attention to her. But that's not exactly how it worked, because it didn't take long for the dark reality to reassert itself. It walked right back into the picture. Teachers at Public School 126 immediately started to notice troubling signs with Elisa. And the first thing they noticed was that she was covered in bruises. And I think she had a pretty significant one on her hand in particular that they were like, how on earth did something like that happen? And then they also noticed that she appeared withdrawn and physically battered. And they asked her family several times, what's going on? Is she okay? How is she getting these injuries? And they got conflicting stories from everyone. Elisa would tell them one thing, and then her family would tell them something completely different. And on top of that, Awilda would straight up tell the school, quote, Well, Elisa lies a lot. And so she was trying to discredit everything Elisa was saying to these teachers, probably because she knew that Elisa had specifically called her mom out to several teachers in the past. The school also was able to kind of compare because all of her siblings went to that exact same school, and none of them exhibited any of the same behaviors as Elisa. It was clear that there was something specifically going on with her. And as time continued, Elisa continued to become more withdrawn. They started noticing that her hair was missing in patches. And I think even some of them noticed that she herself was pulling it out. So she was showing signs of self-mutilation, which again stems from things like severe abuse and trauma. She also sometimes struggled to walk, like she had been severely injured. Elisa had also confided in a doctor that she was being sexually assaulted at home by Carlos. But Awilda at this point started to fight back against all of this. She was claiming that the school actually was out to get her, and so they had told Elisa to say those things just to get her family in trouble. Again, trying to paint Elisa as some liar and trying to paint the school as not a very credible source of information. And so, like so many others had at this point, her teacher and the principal of the public school decided to reach out and report all of their concerns to child welfare. And even after giving them all of that information, they were told by child welfare that none of this information was reportable. Elisa's case file was never looked into before this report was rejected, nor was her caseworker ever actually notified that there had been another complaint. Not like he probably would have done anything anyways based on his past actions. Legitimately, they basically screamed into a void. The bare minimum was done, and they just decided, yeah, we're not going to deal with this, so we're going to brush all of this information off. The fact that this child is claiming she's being sexually assaulted, that she's literally showing up, pulling her hair out at school, covered in bruises, she's still urinating on herself, defecating on herself. We're just going to ignore all of that. And so in retaliation against this school, because Awilda was so mad at anyone who called out the abuse that was happening, Awilda started just hurling all sorts of accusations at the school. She had already said they coached her daughter to claim to a doctor she was being sexually assaulted, but then she took it another step and tried to claim that the school itself was sexually assaulting her. It was honestly a nightmare. And then ultimately, in December of 1994, after the school had finally drawn a line and called child welfare, Awilda abruptly pulled Elisa out of school altogether, and she was never re-enrolled anywhere ever again. From that moment, Elisa was kept hidden at home, isolated from the outside world that had been trying to protect her, and left entirely at the mercy of her abuser. Awilda so specifically took her away from school so that not a single person could question the way that she was being abused at home. And so with Elisa successfully out of the prying eyes of the public, her abuse just escalated to unimaginable levels, and Awilda slowly but surely became more unhinged. At this point, if you haven't kind of gathered, Awilda was back deep in her drug addiction. She was heavily reliant on cocaine, and so was her partner, Carlos, whose temper was just as unpredictable as hers, and he was incredibly violent as well, and they both subjected Elisa to their reign of terror. She just became their personal punching bag. Awilda began to tell people that Elisa was under a voodoo spell that had been placed on her by her father. Like, she genuinely believed there was some sort of curse that was happening. And she also began to speculate that Elisa herself might have been taught voodoo by her father. She started to say things like Elisa was possessed by the devil, that beating her was the only way to rid her of the voodoo that she was under. I don't know if she just created this as a way to justify in her own mind the abuse that she was inflicting on her daughter, or if like the drugs were convincing her that this was legitimately happening. I mean, she wouldn't even refer to Elisa by her actual name. She called her slurs. She claimed to believe that Elisa was under a voodoo spell due specifically to her behavior, which ironically enough actually stemmed directly from the trauma and abuse Awilda inflicted. And so I'm like, you legitimately are more willing to believe that your daughter daughter is under a voodoo spell, then the fact that you are horrifically abusing her is causing her to do these things. Like, can we be so for real right now? Elisa ended up being locked in a dark room for hours at a time. I don't even know if she was ever actually allowed out of her bedroom. She was also denied basic human necessities like access to a bathroom, and instead she was forced to use a bucket. And because she wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom as a 6-year-old child, a 5 and 6-year-old child, she obviously had accidents, and then those accidents would trigger Awilda going absolutely bananas because of her behavior, which would just lead to more severe abuse. Like, it was this vicious cycle that this poor 6-year-old girl was trapped in the middle of. Neighbors also started to hear disturbing sounds coming from the home. They heard thuds, muffled cries, and Elisa's desperate pleas for her mom to stop. Like, they would hear her directly saying, "Mommy, stop, please, no more." And all of these things would end up being drowned out by a radio. And as the screams got louder, the radio got louder. And what's even worse about the situation is that some neighbors did make an effort to report these horrifying things clearly happening in the apartment, while several others completely ignored it. But there were still some moments, despite the fact that Elisa was being kept hostage in her home, there were some alarms raised. And one of those was from one of Awilda's original supporters in February of 1995. So I told you guys about Project Chance. It was that federally funded parenting program that had backed her at the hearing when she ended up gaining custody of Elisa. And they said, oh yeah, she's great. She's a lively mom. Her kids mean everything to her. But now they were horrified, and like, she voluntarily was a part of this program. So they occasionally spent time together and did check-ins and things along those lines. And they started noticing some of this really messed up stuff. And so Project Chance ended up sending a letter to child welfare saying that they suspected sexual abuse, that Elisa was showing signs of severe trauma, self-destructive behaviors. They also pointed out the fact that she hadn't been attending school, that Awilda took her out and had no intentions of putting her back anywhere else. And they also pointed out that there had been no help provided by any agency, that child welfare, who was supposed to be protecting Elisa, hadn't noticed any of this stuff, hadn't done anything about it. But when this letter was sent in, it went to one of the many offices, and somehow that letter never actually made it to Elisa's caseworker. They actually weren't aware of it until after her death while they were doing an investigation. Then another anonymous letter dated March 14th, 1995 showed up at the child welfare office, and it also warned that Elisa was in a really bad situation, that her hair had been forcibly cut off, that she was being kept in a dark room. I personally theorize that this was also sent by one of the workers with Project Chance. However, that is just my speculation. But they were one of the only others to know Elisa's hair had been cut off. And her caseworker did, in fact, make a report on this. He did go to the house, but he said that it wasn't self-mutilation, that another family member or someone else had cut her hair off. So he just kind of accepted this information that was fed to him by Awilda and moved along. But had even an ounce of extra energy been put into further investigation, he would have found that Awilda had already given several different versions to other agencies and other people about how Elisa's hair had been cut off. She was contradicting herself left and right and just feeding people whatever she thought they would accept and move on with. And so those two red flags were just completely shot down, which is so unfortunate because 6 days later, there was yet another incident. At 10:45 p.m., Elisa showed up with Carlos to a hospital with a fractured shoulder. Now, Carlos explained to the nurses and the doctors that Elisa had broken it jumping from a bunk bed in the house, that she had been playing, she fell down, broke it. That was that. However, they noticed that the injury had occurred at least 3 days prior. She did not immediately come in to the hospital, and this would have caused her excruciating pain. And so they're like, okay, well, how are you here so late? And he also had an explanation for this. He claimed that Elisa was scared to tell her mom that she hurt her arm. She didn't want to get in trouble for roughhousing. And so it took her 3 days of sitting in excruciating pain to finally come forward and say something and be taken to the doctor's office. Now, this rang alarm bells for doctors right away, that there was something more to this. They also noticed that Elisa had several cuts on her face. She had scarring, different bruises. And when they asked Elisa about these cuts that were like on her lips, like she had been hit or something, she instead gave them this really unbelievable story that she had eaten sugar and so roaches had bit her. They ended up speaking to Oscar for like 3+ hours trying to figure out if this was a situation where there was abuse happening at home. And the doctor actually directly stated in a news article later on that he knew there were bad things happening at this house. Like this family was not right. And so ultimately they made a call to child welfare, and that same caseworker came out and ended up speaking to Elisa and Carlos. And after a little bit, not even a day's worth of investigation, her caseworker was like, well, we're just going to go ahead and settle this because Elisa confirmed what Carlos said. She jumped off a bunk bed and hurt herself. Clearly, there's no abuse happening in the home. And so that was it. And what's so bonkers about that is not just the fact that he, again, took this at very surface level and believed it, but also he was supposed to perform a mandatory home visit, especially because in the past couple of weeks alone, a federally funded agency, they're saying they expect there's severe abuse happening. There was also the anonymous letter saying, hey, something's up with this. And so you would think third time's a charm here, just in the past like a month alone, but it just didn't happen. And so 2 weeks later, there was another horrifying incident. Bart O'Connor from Project Chance ended up receiving a call from Awilda, and she began just rambling in hysterics that Elisa was drinking from the toilet. She was exhibiting other alarming behaviors. She was like, there's something wrong with this girl. Like, I want her taken away. And so Bart, horrified something bad was going to happen, rushed to the home and opened the door to the smell of urine. There was feces smeared on objects all around the home. Elisa's toys were everywhere. And so he's like, we have to step in. Like, something's got to be done. And so he ended up calling Elisa's caseworker at child welfare. And I am sure you guys already know exactly how this is going to go. He's like, hey, look, there is clear self-destructive behaviors going on. This little girl is self-mutilating. She's only 6 years old. Like, this is signs of severe trauma and abuse. We have to take her and put her into some sort of psychological care because this is not all right. You need to come out here immediately, see this for yourself. But her caseworker legitimately said he was too busy. Not only that, but Awilda said specifically she wasn't going to sacrifice her other children for Elisa. A foreshadowing statement, in my opinion, that should have been taken as seriously as possible. Because there was no assistance from child welfare, Project Chance decided to take Elisa straight to a local hospital for psychiatric assistance themselves. Like, they're like, okay, we can't leave here doing absolutely nothing, so we're going to do what we can. And Awilda agreed with this. She was like, yep, we'll get her in there for inpatient treatment. She'll be better. But after just 6 hours in the hospital, Awilda flipped a switch. And so Awilda decided to take her home. She wanted to discharge her from the hospital and instead opted for outpatient treatment. And they were supposed to have a whole plan in place to get that done. And yet another move that I will never begin to understand. After all of this happened, like all of those things that I just said, her caseworker was like, yeah, this is it. All is well. You know what it's time to do? It's finally time to close Elisa's case. Like, in what world can you have a child that's 6 years old admitted to a hospital for self-mutilation, needing deep psychiatric care? Does the caseworker that's there to protect that child say, perfect, everything's better now, we no longer have to work this case? And even after making that decision, he ended up failing to even properly close her case, which part of me is thankful for. And part of me is just like, seriously, like, you cannot get your job done. I'm just not understanding where the disconnect is here. And they didn't even realize that he didn't properly shut her case until after death, when it was revealed that Elisa's case was technically still open. And she had been under the agency's protection when she died, which meant that they were screwed because they failed to protect her. And from that point on, Elisa fully went under the radar. I mean, they really did just like wash their hands of this and say, well, whatever happens to her happens. And this brings us to the weeks before her murder. On Halloween of 1995, Carlos delivered a particularly brutal beating to Elisa in front of all of her siblings, which I am personally surprised did not kill her. She had her head repeatedly hit into a concrete wall. And shortly after, on November 15th, 1995, Carlos ended up being jailed on a parole violation related to his earlier assault on Awilda when he stabbed her 17 times with a pocket knife. This left Awilda at home alone with Elisa when clearly things were not well within the family. And to no shock on my end, within days of being left alone with this little girl, Elisa's life was taken. November 22nd, Awilda made a call to her sister, Mercy Torres, and what she said to her was shocking. She told Mercy that Elisa was laying on her bed pretty much unresponsive, and I won't use the actual word that she used to describe her daughter, but she went on to say that Elisa wasn't eating, she wasn't drinking, she wasn't using the bathroom, and fluid was coming from her nose and her mouth. And so obviously hearing this information, Mercy's like, you need to take her to the hospital right now, and even offered to come and watch the rest of her children so that Awilda could go with Elisa. But Awilda coldly replied that she would think about it after she finished cleaning her dishes. And she never ended up taking Elisa to the hospital. She legitimately decided that cleaning her dishes was more important than saving her 6-year-old little girl that was actively dying in front of her. The following day, November 23rd, 1995, which was Thanksgiving morning, a downstairs neighbor, Francisco Santana, ended up being brought up to the family's apartment by Awilda. He followed Awilda to Elisa's bedroom, where he found her unresponsive, lifeless body. Elisa Izquierdo, whose life had once held so much potential, was taken away by a cascade of failures. A failure of her mother, a failure of a system, and a failure of society as a whole. Everybody failed this helpless little girl. Santana felt Elisa's body and realized it was cold and he couldn't find a pulse. And so he became hysterical and he started to plead with Awilda to call the police. And he pleaded with her for 2 hours. She was saying all these scary things and he's trying to keep her calm. I'm sure the other kids were in the house. Like, he was doing his damnedest given the situation to manage this in a calm way, to have her do the right thing, knowing that if he did one wrong thing, it was probably going to set off a bomb in that entire house. And so he tried as hard as he could to get her to just call the police. But after those 2 hours passed and he had exhausted every option possible, he finally realized there was no way around it. And so he called 911 himself. And sure enough, that bomb went off. Awilda became absolutely uncontrollable and she ran to the roof saying that she was going to end her own life. And she did attempt to jump off the roof before they managed to restrain her, I guess several of the people living at the apartment, until police were able to arrive. And once they did, she immediately confessed that all of this was her doing. Awilda said that 2 days prior, she had thrown Elisa headfirst into a concrete wall. For 2 days, you guys, Elisa laid in bed. Her brain was swelling. Her brain was bleeding. She just laid there with no help for 48 plus hours until she died by herself. The rage that brings out of me is like unexplainable, because no person in general deserves to die that way, especially not a 6-year-old little girl. Her autopsy showed that there was no part of her that wasn't burned or bruised or welted or broken. She had bones sticking out of places of her body. And they found 30 perfect circles on her skin that they initially thought were like cigarette burns, and instead found them to perfectly match a ring that Awilda always wore. And I'm like trying my hardest to keep it together, but like I legitimately cannot, because I know things that I can't even tell you guys because of how fucked they are. Like, what I have revealed to you guys about what happened to Elisa is so awful, but it's literally leaving out 80% of what happened to her. 80% of what this woman did and the torturous things that she experienced to try to preserve some sort of dignity for Elisa. And this is what I was saying, that even at its barest form, it is like unbearable to think about what happened to this little girl, and to know the things that I do of how much worse it got is just like unimaginable. I don't think I've ever seen like this kind of abuse toward a child before. I've covered a lot of really tragic, dark things, and this is like makes those things pale in comparison. Absolutely pale. Now, facing overwhelming evidence, Awilda, thankfully, in my opinion, ultimately pled guilty on June 24th, 1996 to second-degree murder, along with multiple counts of abuse and depraved indifference to human life. Now, I'm thinking that she didn't face first-degree murder charges because, like, the immediate action she took didn't kill Elisa, but instead it was like the injuries and problems afterward that ultimately killed her. I still so wish she had been charged with first degree. I think everyone probably does. And in August of 1996, she was ultimately sentenced to the maximum sentence at the time, which was 15 years to life in prison. Now, Carlos Lopez, though he wasn't there during Elisa's final days, he was incarcerated. He was also held accountable, apparently specifically for that Halloween night abuse that was witnessed by the whole family, when yet again, Elisa's head was thrown into a concrete wall several times. And so in October of 1996, he ended up pleading guilty to second-degree assault and was sentenced to an additional 1.5 to 3 years in prison, which I guess is better than the 2 months that he got for stabbing his freaking wife and mother of his children. And that was on top of other unrelated sentences that he was serving at the time. Elisa Izquierdo's death ignited an outpouring of grief and outrage across New York City. Families, neighbors, educators, child advocates all wanted answers. How can a little girl be allowed to suffer so profoundly and no one notices or does anything? And obviously there were a lot of people directly in Elisa's life that were speaking out, saying, we raised red flags, we reported these things. It was child welfare that did nothing. So even before anyone had any information from child welfare, any statements were made, any investigations were done, it was clear who had failed her right alongside her mother. Hundreds of people attended Elisa's funeral, and it was open casket to show people the realities of what happened to her and how exactly she was failed. They didn't want people to be able to continue turning a blind eye to what was going on in the world. And the Reverend in his eulogy said, quote, "Elisa was not killed only by the hand of a sick individual, but by the impotence of silence of many, by the neglect of child welfare institutions, and the moral mediocrity that has intoxicated our neighborhoods." There was deep frustration directed at all of the agencies that were meant to protect children. People wanted to know where this went wrong, why so many complaints had been ignored, how many complaints even were there, and why were caseworkers saying that they were too busy to help in moments of crisis. The Child Welfare Administration, or the CWA, spent this entire time consistently defending keeping its records sealed, citing confidentiality laws, even as evidence continued to emerge showing systemic failures that had repeatedly allowed Elisa's abuse to go unchecked. There were internal memos, leaked reports, and they ended up revealing that there had been budget cuts that left the entire agency dangerously understaffed. Caseworkers were being burdened with 25 to 30 cases each, having little time to investigate every report of abuse. And the commissioner had even stated in one of these memos that it was to the point that they weren't even able to train their caseworkers on how to recognize signs of abuse or handle the situations. And I feel like it's pretty safe to say majority of the cases they're handling involve abuse. So how is that acceptable? And not just that, the commissioner even admitted that they hadn't even been able to vet their caseworkers to make sure they were competent enough to do the job. It was revealed that so many complaints hadn't even been directed to the right caseworker or to the caseworker at all when it came to Elisa. They had been brushed off without second thought from from just the first Joe Blow that answered the phone to listen to the complaint without any further investigation. No one had ever looked into her case file. And so obviously an intense investigation into the Child Welfare Administration revealed so many flaws that it just makes your head spin. Like the entire time looking at this and hearing some of the statistics, I could not pick my jaw off the floor. It ended up being revealed that when reports were deemed unfounded, they would expunge all of those reports from the record. So half the time, no one even knew that there was this extensive pattern indicating they were obviously missing something. I mean, if you have someone looking into a singular report of abuse and they look into it and it's unfounded, that's one thing. But when you look into someone's file and find that there have been like 15 different instances where abuse has been reported, even if it's unsubstantiated, I feel like common sense would tell you at that point, maybe we're missing something. Maybe there's something going on that's being hidden and we need to do a little bit more to find it. But instead, all of those things are being deleted, so every time was treated like the first time. But even with that being said, I feel like that only applies to a handful of people involved in the case, because she did have specific people, specific workers, that even if things were not kept in her file or not, they should have remembered. They were there for it. They took those calls. They had those conversations. And so even with all those things being expunged, those people, those caseworkers should have known and should have still done something. And while no caseworkers ended up being criminally charged in this, several ended up resigning after the internal investigation revealed they directly failed to intervene on numerous occasions. It was even found that the CWA's, quote, own neglect allowed or contributed to the tragedy and a third of the child fatality cases they were involved in. And in case you didn't hear it the first time, I'm going to repeat it again because it is probably the most insane thing I've ever heard. The CWA's own neglect allowed or contributed to the tragedy in a third of the child fatality cases they were involved in. What? How is that even possible? They also found that one particular child protection manager was in charge of 40 caseworkers, so overseeing 40 people, and those 40 caseworkers had over 1,000 cases. On top of that, they found that her caseworker was technically supposed to visit her once a month at her home to make sure everything was okay. They were supposed to go do their due diligence, and instead they found that in that last year prior to her death, her caseworker only came 3 times. Only one of those was actually properly documented. And so there's no telling if the other 2 actually even happened, because those 2 were only spoken about by his attorney after he was called out for his lack of proper work in the case. Not only that, but they also found that this agency had lost files for over 16,000 children that had been potentially abused or neglected and reported to the agency. 16,000, okay? And to put that into perspective, about 11,000 went into foster care that year. So there's no telling what percentage of those children probably should have been removed from the home for safety reasons. Leaders in child advocacy pointed out the practice of expunging unsubstantiated abuse claims, this policy that had erased a potentially significant pattern of neglect in Elisa's case. And they argue that if these records had been maintained, there was a huge chance that Elisa's fate could have been different. They also pointed out that the CWA was using the confidentiality law as a shield. And I mean, really sit and think about the irony of the fact that child welfare was using the ability to hide behind closed doors to hide their wrongdoings in the exact same way, just a different circumstance, that Awilda hid behind closed doors to abuse her child without anyone questioning it. And these are the people that are supposed to be protecting her. Why are there similarities in their behaviors? And so these different advocates started to push for legislative change. And in February of 1996, Governor George Pataki, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, signed into law what would become known as Elisa's Law. Now, this landmark legislation mandated that all child abuse records, including unsubstantiated reports, be retained for up to 10 years after a child turns 18. And so if for whatever reason they feel like it needs to stay on there longer, they can do it. And so this ensured that recurring patterns of abuse cannot be hidden away and instead used to protect children in situations like Elisa's. Elisa's law also made case histories where there have been convictions specifically or deaths of a child transparent. So not just willy-nilly any abuse case, but where there have been like serious actions taken, all of those have to be public knowledge. So child welfare agencies couldn't hide behind those confidentiality laws, but instead those files would now be a part of a record that could be reviewed and scrutinized by the public so that missteps could actually be noticed. And at that point, things could be changed for the better of not just the agency, but also the children that they serve. On top of that, New York City established the ACS, or the Administration for Children's Services, and this was done shortly after Elisa's death to further reform the system. And ACS was basically created as a standalone agency to oversee child protective services, so things like foster care and family support programs, because obviously they cannot oversee themselves. They just literally dig themselves into a hole and they keep on digging until they legitimately cannot get out. And so this was a pretty effective way that they were able to make sure everything was working right, all the wheels were greased, the proper things were being done, and it also helped to drastically reduce the caseloads that had once been overwhelming caseworkers. And as an example, by 2001, the average caseload per worker in the area dropped from 25 to 30 cases to around 13. And this allowed for more individualized and compassionate one-on-one approaches to each child and family situation. And this is why it was so important to me to tell you guys about this case, because I've spoken about so many cases in the past year and a half where there have been legislative changes that have come from them, but a lot of them are really current. So I wanted to be able to bring you guys something where you're actually able to see the difference that it's made, see the amount of children that it has probably saved, the amount of caseworkers that it has helped do their job properly, and show you guys why it's so important to support these families, to support these different laws people are bringing forward, because 10, 20, 30 years from now, people are going to be able to look back and be like, wow, that law that people fought so hard for made all the difference. So all in all, it's just a much better system. Granted, there are still plenty of flaws and still so many ways that these agencies can be changed. I feel like Elisa's case taught everyone a really difficult lesson about the cost of silence, the consequences of a flawed system that you allow to go unchecked. Everyone that had the pleasure of getting to know Elisa, even at such a young age, knew that she was so special and that she was going to go on to do outrageous things. And to see that that was all taken away from her at 6 is so upsetting. But to also be able to say that here we are decades later and she's still gone on to do so many things and help so many people, I feel like it's just the silver lining that you have to look at and have to remember. I genuinely believe it's the best way to honor these victims and these families, because I know that her dad would be so proud and her death was not in vain. On that note, you guys, that is all that I have for you today. I want to say a huge thank you to those of you who have taken the time to listen to this, because it is not lost on me that this was a horrific thing to hear about. I hope that at least some of you have taken away why this case is so important, because it is in our hands. It's in our power to change things for the better every single day. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.